Hello everyone, we're back once again for the third video in the Karl Popper series here about the Open Society and its Enemies, which is a very important book by Karl Popper. So thus far we have done the preface by George Soros and the introduction by Alan. Anyway, and now we're about to do Personal Recollections of the Publication of the Open Society by E.H. Gombrich. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and switch to our main view, and let's get through this Kindle book here. Alright, Karl Popper's two-volume work, The Open Society and Its Enemies, was published 50 years ago. It stands to reason that this happy event was preceded by a long period of preparation and uncertainty. In fact, the publication took 2.5 years from the moment that he sent the manuscript from New Zealand to wartime England, and by that time, he and his wife were on the boat taking them to London to start a new life here at the LSE, which is short for the London School of Economics. Though all this is by now very long ago, fortunately I need not rely on my memory of these events, because I was personally much involved, and hence the recipient of any number of letters which I naturally kept. During most of the war, such air letters from overseas were miniaturized to save space and weight, and I have no less than 95 such aerogram forms in addition to other communications relating to his job here at the LSE. They make fascinating reading, and all I can try is to give you samples of these surviving documents. So this is going to be more of a look at letters and a look into who Karl Popper was. So we're still sort of introducing the work. We haven't even gotten to Popper's own introduction yet. I'm drinking some matcha green tea to help me stay awake here, and also possibly lubricate my vocal cords just a little bit, because I noticed that I was getting kind of talked out during the last video. So, alright, those things in mind. But first, a very few words about the background. Popper was 7 years my senior, and though I had heard of him in my native Vienna, we only met very fleetingly. It so happened that my father, who was a solicitor, had the statutory years of his apprenticeship with Karl's father, who was also a lawyer, and they must have kept in touch. For Karl mentioned in one of his letters how helpful my father had been at the time Karl's father had died. In any case, our friendship only dates from the spring of 1936, when I was a junior research fellow at the Warburg Institute, and he came to this country at the invitation of Susan Stebbing. One of our joint acquaintances must have given him my address. We both lived in the Paddington area, and we met with increasing frequency. I still remember having been incautious enough to mention that I had read a pamphlet by Rudolf. I found that interesting, he said. And from then on, I remained a little selective in what I told him. That's an interesting little insight, isn't it? Okay. So in 1936, I was 27 and Popper was 34. My wife and I visited him and his wife, Henny, during a stay in Vienna, and we also saw them during the few days they again spent in London in 1937 before sailing to New Zealand, which was then, as Henny once wrote, halfway to the moon. After the outbreak of the war in 1930, I joined the listening post, or monitoring service, of the BBC. I remember writing to Karl, possibly before that date, but I do not think I received an answer. Then in May 1943, when the BBC had moved to reading, I got a letter from him dated 16th April, the 1st of 95. It turned out later that Karl had no idea where I lived, and only got my address almost fortuitously, thanks to a common acquaintance. And so begins the saga of the book, intertwined with that of his readership here, for which Hayek had asked him to stay, a believer, as he said, in piecemeal social... Oh, I guess I pressed the wrong. Okay, let's back up just a second. Then in May 1943, when the BBC had moved to reading, I got a letter from him dated 16th of April, the 1st of 95. It turned out later that Karl had no idea where I lived and only got my address almost fortuitously, thanks to a common acquaintance. And so begins the saga of the book, intertwined with that of his readership here, for which Hayek had asked him to apply. Dear Ernst, the letter began. Ernst, I have not heard from you for a long time, and I was very glad to get your cable. I very much hope that all is well with you and your family. The reason why you have not heard from us is that I have been writing a book. The manuscript is finished. Its title is A Social Philosophy for Every Man. It has about 700 pages, i.e. about 280,000 words. I believe that the book is topical and its publication urgent, if one can say such a thing at a time when only one thing is really important, the winning of the war. The book is a new philosophy of politics and of history, and an examination of the principles of democratic reconstruction. It also tries to contribute to an understanding of the totalitarian revolt against civilization, and to show that this is as old as our democratic civilization itself. Let me pause here for a moment to allow Popper's own description of his book to sink in, that the totalitarian revolt against civilization is as old as our democratic civilization itself. I feel that too many readers of the book were either dazzled or irritated by its lengthy polemics, and all but miss the central point of the argument. The book offers an explanatory hypothesis for the persistent hostility to the open society. Totalitarian ideologies are interpreted as reactions to what is described as the strain of civilization, or the sense of drift which is associated with the transition from the closed tribal societies of the past to the individualistic civilization that originated in Athens in the 5th century BC. You may call it a psychological diagnosis, though Karl might not have accepted this description without qualification. In any case, I must return to his letter. In view of the immense postal and other difficulties, it is absolutely impossible to send the book from here to a publisher and have it sent back if it is rejected, for that would mean anything up to 1 year's delay in case of one rejection. This is why I need somebody in England who sends the manuscript to the various publishers. On the 28th of April, having received my consent, he sent me the manuscript together with a letter and other material. So this man, E.H. Gombrich, is the reason that we get to read The Open Society and Its Enemies. He helped Karl Popper with the publication. So let's continue with another letter from Popper here. He says, I am ashamed that I have not written to you for such a long time. I cannot tell you how much it means to me that you were there and will look after the manuscript. You have no idea how completely hopeless and isolated one often feels in my situation. But I must tell you what happened so far to the book since I finished it in October 1942. I had heard that the paper shortage which was pressing in USA, also the distance is smaller. For these reasons, I sent a copy to the USA branch of Macmillan, which I gather is quite independent of the English Macmillan. At the same time, I wrote to the only friend I had in the USA, of whose address I was sure, asking him to act on my behalf. Macmillan turned the book down without even having read it. And this is more or less all I know after 6 months. I've published books before. That's accurate. That's the way it works. Robert Piercy notably sent Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance to, I believe, 100 different publishers before he finally got it printed. And that was a best-selling book, just as this was. So even when you have a very, very strong book, you can have a very difficult time getting the word out about it. So that resonates with me. He said, my friend unfortunately seems to have done absolutely nothing, although he had very full instructions. He did not even bother to write before February 16th, acknowledging the receipt of the manuscript which he got in December, and in this acknowledgement he wrote nothing about what he had done, because he had done nothing, and obviously he is not going to do anything. He only congratulates me to my effort in writing such a big book. I don't blame him, after all. It isn't his book, but you can understand what it means to get such a completely empty letter after waiting for 6 months. The situation is really rather dreadful. I feel that if one has written a book, one ought not to be forced to go begging to have it read and printed. I agree with him there. Alright, getting another drink of green tea here. This is a fairly long little section, so I'm going to kind of settle in, take my time, and try to read it accurately with as few mistakes as I can make. From later conversations, I know, of course, who that unreliable friend was, but I'm not going to reveal his name. It turns out not to have been quite true that he did absolutely nothing. Feeling quite helpless with such a work which was far removed from his field, he sent it to a well-known professor of political science at one of the Ivy League universities. After a time, the manuscript was returned to him with a note saying that it was impossible to advocate the publication of a book which speaks so disrespectfully of Plato. So there's controversy here. This is a lot like what happened to Nietzsche, although, of course, Popper ended up getting it published and it did quite well even in its own time, unlike Nietzsche's work. Oh, excuse me. I'm kind of getting tired here, so bear with me just a little bit, guys. In the parcel which I received, I've found a carefully drafted letter which Karl wanted me to send to the publishers, together with the manuscript. There were another formidable 3 pages with the headline, What I Should Like You to Do, giving a list of 17 publishers with their addresses in the order of desirability. There are 18 points of introduction, some with subheadings A, B, C, but just let me quote item 5. I enclosed 2 different title pages, a social philosophy for everyman and a critique of political philosophy. The reason why I have 2 different titles is that I am not quite satisfied with either. What would you say to a social philosophy for our time? Is that too pretentious? On May 4th, Karl wrote another lengthy letter revising the order of publishers. Up to that point, I had very little idea of how the Poppers were actually living in New Zealand, but on the 29th of July, Henny sent us a very lively 3-page letter from which I want to quote a few passages. So this is Henny speaking now and not Karl. We live in a suburb on the hills with a very beautiful view across Christchurch and the Canterbury Plains. The climate is not nearly perfect as things in this world can be, but very long summers with an abundance of sunshine. It gets frightfully dry, and the raising of vegetables is not quite easy. I try hard in the little time I have, and from October till May we eat only homegrown vegetables, mainly peas, beans, potatoes, carrots, spinach, silver beet, lettuce, and tomatoes. It is really never quite sufficient, but we have to make the best of it. The rest of the year we live chiefly on a carrot and rice diet, for economy's sake. Karl's salary was never adequate and is now so less than ever. During the term time, Karl can only work at the weekends, but during the summer holidays he worked literally 24 hours a day. For the last 3 or 4 months he was in a state of almost complete exhaustion. He hardly went to bed because he could not sleep. Karl just finished 2 days before college started again. On both days which remained from our holiday, we went to the sea and ate as many ice creams as we could. I had planned it long ago that we would celebrate the end with eating as many ice creams as we wanted. So she's telling a story here of a difficult life, and I can kind of understand this because philosophers don't tend to make very much money. It is not the most lucrative profession unless you do a really good job of getting the work out as far as your books are concerned and managing to sell them, which is it's just not an easy thing to do. Getting right back in here, he says, poor Henny. What she does not say in this letter is how hard she had to work on the book and the correspondence, almost day and night. A much later date, the 24th of October 1944, she wrote to us, "This isn't a proper letter at all. I'm just rattling it off on the typewriter," and of course rattling it off is terribly exaggerated. "I'm the worst possible typist, and the more distance I gain from the last nightmare years of typing, the less I can understand how on earth I managed it." Let me add, by way of explanation, that Karl always wrote by hand in the fluent, lucid script of a former schoolteacher. I could not but smile when I saw an item in the Sotheby's catalog, photographed and described as Popper's typewriter. I very much doubt that Karl ever touched its keyboard. That's incredible. I mean, it just goes to show how much we rely on other people. It's I don't know. and how little credit women get in history for doing the things that she's talking about having done here. So really, I don't know, that's an important part of this, an important part of the history, let's say. So we can expect Popper's philosophy to perhaps be a little bit more polished than it would have otherwise been. And perhaps maybe there's more of it than there would have otherwise been, because I can attest to the difficulties of typing and typesetting an entire philosophy book. And my book was not as long as The Open Society and Its Enemies. So that's actually a really remarkable point. I'm glad that Gombrich is able to touch on that. So he left it to Henny in what she described as the nightmare years to type and retype countless versions and revisions. Not that Karl was not utterly devoted to her. He suffered agonies when she was ill, but he was convinced that the importance of his work always had to override his own comfort, that of Henny, and possibly also my own, as the future was to show. Meanwhile, on the 19th of August, I received a long letter dealing with some critical remarks which he had encouraged me to make on reading the book. For instance, I fully agree with your remark that the humanitarian democratic creed of the West is historically and emotionally based on Christianity, but this fact has no bearing on my theory as far as I can see. Or has it? I must have expostulated to him that he ridiculed Hegel, but did not say a word about Schopenhauer, and he replied, although Schopenhauer was a reactionary, egoistically concerned only with the safety of his investments, he openly acknowledges this. His absolute intellectual integrity is beyond doubt. To be sure, his will is not better than Hegel's spirit, but what Schopenhauer says and how he says it sufficiently proves that he was an honest thinker. He did all he could to make himself understood. Hegel did not intend to be understood. He wanted to impress, to dazzle his readers. Schopenhauer always wrote sense, and sometimes excellence. This moon review of Schopenhauer, right? Fine. I believe we operate of. I think it's somewhat surprising that he's such a fan of Schopenhauer and anyway, I'm impression political issue on philosophical issues. Perhaps there was only Dr. Whaley's 3 ways of thought in ancient Egypt, because struck by certain similarities between and that described by Whaley. Popper responded by writing that he had always been much attracted by these, but always felt concerning the possible interpretation, considering how Plato, for example, has been his thought and language. This remained his attitude. It was never easy to interpret of others' civilizations. Part of philosophical. I might like to remind Popper that one way of getting involved with the context and read them. We got preferences, and you know, to me, this like plus. On the 9th of December, 43 wrote a few years ago. Course of my life. I had been asked to find out whether Karl would accept a readership at LSE. I advised Karl, your friend who is acting for you here, to apply in your name when some advertisement is published, and supply a friend who is acting for me, Karl continued. You see that I have no choice. I must trouble you again to spare you. 4 days later, Karl wrote, "We are of course terribly excited, shaken up in confidence of my readership. I do not think that I shall get it, owing to the fact I have such publication. We shall be of course disappointed, much as we try to fortify ourselves against such a development. I was so nicely working along with a new paper on probability, and now my peace is gone, my heart is heavy. Don't think that I am ungrateful. Nobody can feel more strongly than I feel about Hayek. He must have worked for me like anything, and the moral effect of this on me is of course tremendous." Okay, in consequence, I received more instructions from Karl, his CV, a list of references, and texts and testimonials he had previously had. I also received, then or a little later, 2.5 folio pages with comments on the notes of the book. Karl realized, of course, that the notes seemed excessively long and complex, and I had also made certain suggestions. Needless to say, he tried to prove that the arrangement he had chosen was the only possible one. I have most carefully constructed the text in such a way that it is absolutely self-contained for a reader who simply belongs to the educated public, and who has no scientific axe to grind. There is nothing in the text that is hard to understand without the notes. I have spent immense labor on this point. His comments, in fact, revealed that if this is the word, the importance Karl attached to his book. I am definitely against cuts. I believe that the book is of sufficient value to sometimes be a trifle less brief than it might be possibly to make it. I do not know of any work of which one could not say the same, often to a much higher degree. The book is written with unusual care. I know hardly anybody who is so scrupulous and conscientious in all details as I am, with the effect that, as everyone admits at once, the book achieves a rare degree of lucidity and simplicity. And this is in a book which, as you will admit, thronged with thoughts on every single page. I entirely reject the contention that there is the slightest intrinsic reason for cuts. The extrinsic reason that the book is a very long book, I admit. But since ordinary intelligent people have read through the text in one weekend, it cannot be too long. And regarding the prospect of selling a long book, the ordinary intelligent man does not like to be treated as illiterate or as an imbecile. He is ready and even proud to buy a thick book. I know there is no page in the book which is not full with worthwhile thoughts. This cannot be said of very many books. I agree with him there too. I think it's very important to try to write in such a way that with minimal education people can follow your work. That's great. Oh, and yeah, the man writing the introduction agrees. He says he was surely right. And now the period began when he began sending me revisions and changes to be made to his manuscript. He was still very uncertain about the best title, and on the 22nd asked, "What do you think of the Open Society and its Enemies, or of A Social Philosophy for Our Time?" Which latter title is, of course, very pretentious. The winter and spring of 1933 and 1944, I had to report to him many disappointments and a number of publishers who rejected the book. I believe that this is a story that can be told of many important books, but here I can document it. However, in February 1944, I got a letter from Herbert Reed, then a director of Routledge, reporting that Hayek had sent him Karl's manuscript. I am enormously impressed by it, but before presenting a case to my colleagues, I should be glad if you would kindly give me a little more information about the author. This I did, and Herbert Reed acknowledged it gratefully. Karl received the contract from Routledge in April 1944, but instantly began to worry about the U.S. copyright, and now he began to rewrite the book, and I was charged with applying these corrections to the manuscript. It is true that I had his approval to engage somebody to help, an approval which was very necessary because, after all, I had to do my own work. For instance, on the 30th of April, he announced that he was sending by the same mail 11 other airgraphs containing the corrections. They look like more than they are, writes Karl, but to me they seem quite sufficient. He expressed the hope that nobody would touch his text, confirming what I have also experienced. I've only too often found that the corrections made matters worse. To be sure, any suggestion for a correction proves that something is not quite in order, but too often the remedy turns out to be worse than the original mistake. Wow, that's incredible. Yeah, that's something I've had experience with as well. In my recent essay about Albert Camus, The Plague and the Plague, it's about Camus' book, The Plague in particular, and it's read from sort of a very 2020 standpoint. The publisher actually did make some corrections, and maybe those corrections were not always ideal. There was a place where they mentioned cholera, and I had not mentioned cholera in the initial text at all. And one of the readers on the Partially Examined Live Facebook page actually did notice that. So again, I apologize for that, but publishing industry being what it is, that's a very common error to have. So continuing, on the 4th of September, he announced in addition that he had completely rewritten Chapter 17, which duly arrived. I hope I may quote a fuller sample of the type of letters which arrive so frequently. In my typed paragraph of today, I mentioned that as far as Chapter 12 is concerned, only the section number corrections have first priority. I now wish to amend this. There is also a false quotation which is important to replace. It is the quotation on manuscript page 281 from hence in the line 5 to the end of paragraph in line 7. I suggest to correct these lines in accordance with my correction to Chapter 12, paragraph 4. This, however, would imply that the passage on page 281 is replaced by one that is about 2 lines longer. If this creates difficulties, then I suggest to replace the hence passage by the following of about equal length, plus states may enter into agreements, but they are superior agreements, yada yada. I guess we don't need to read every detail of that, but you can tell that the Popper was very analytical and very invested in this work. This was his masterpiece, this was his life's work, and he wanted it to be perfect. It must have been kind of tough to be friends with the guy during this time. He said, no wonder he wrote, it will be a colossal job for everybody concerned. It was a colossal job here, and I was and am very ill while doing it. The doctor has strictly forbidden any work, and I am, of course, now absolutely down again. Excuse me. Around that an episode, I decided to publish the book, or as it was publishing the second time interval. It was during these discussions that I sent a cable to Karl from our village office post. Rutledge went division after Chapter 10. A few hours later, I was summoned to the post office and asked what it all meant. The word division had alerted a censor who thought, of course, of army divisions. Luckily, I was believed. Another complication that Karl received a number of offers from, from other universities in New Zealand and Australia, and naturally did not want to give up the chance of London, but nobody seemed to get but needed badly to get a decision. In October, he reports on 2 important articles, Private and Public Values, and the other, The Refutation of Determinism. A third one, under the title Logic of Freedom, is probably too long for being tackled during the vacations. When these 3 articles are finished, I intend to give up political philosophy and to return to practical methodology, especially of the natural sciences. Last year, I finished some papers on mathematical logic, which I did not try to publish so far because of their length. If possible, I should like to cut them now. This is my working program. Apart from that, I want to do some music. We have not been able to afford a piano here. I had a beautiful Bosendorfer in Vienna, and I could not bring myself to buying a very bad piano. Besides, even the worst ones cost more than we could afford. So I bought a harmonium for, I guess that's £3. I'm not sure what that number is or how to get it, and it is not so bad, but I am getting hungry for a little time. Of a publication date from all of a post. In spite of the king know enough of Australia. I absolutely love the opportunity of koala bear is worth putting in, and it is reservation. In April 1945, another cloud appeared on the horizon. Karl, as you say, the whole affair is pretty awful, and so is the fact that 18 days after your letter, the registrar of London University has not answered. He was dealing with admirers and friends among his colleagues. His department had all but persecuted him. It was Karl had once said, "This we cannot help, and nobody will." He goes, "Well, wait a second. He's too ridiculous, really? That's why they're giving him a hard time. That's a reason to try to hold somebody down." No, Herbert Reed. I'm not. Pay. So what I'm going to do? Work. Okay. Got another little. He says, "Is the presence of somebody who works hard and endangers certain accepted standards, I mean standards of relaxation, all chairs are easy chairs. These difficulties have much increased by the writing of a book, and still more, of course, by the delay in its publication. I am terribly sorry to hear that you feel so exhausted, but I can well understand it. I long to hear you speak of your experiences and of what you have learned during these years. Will it ever be? I am nearly 43 now, and if I don't manage to see you before I am 45, I may never have the opportunity. I don't think that anybody would import to England a lecturer over the age of 45. So he's getting up there. That's tough. I know how that feels a little bit too. Though I know the time is getting on, I really must quote for you the whole story of how Karl received the news of his appointment, as he told in his letter of the 12th of June 1945. During the whole of April I was ill again. I'm now always getting such terrible colds, starting with a very sore throat and developing in all directions. I was very weak. My doctor insisted that I should go to the mountains during the May vacations, and we both went to Hermitage, the foot of Mount Cook, the highest mountain here. I was first pretty miserable there, but after 2 days I had a marvelous recovery. We went up to a hut, the Ball Hut, see pictures in Mount Cook and the glaciers, where we were very happy. On the bus journey back from the Hermitage, yeah, I guess this isn't the French pronunciation, it's just Hermitage. He says, on May 21st, in the village called Fairley, the postmistress came with a cable to the bus. It was addressed to Karl Popper, care of bus, from Hermitage to Fairley, and said, "Congratulations on London appointment, and thanks for excellent article inquiring about permits, Frederick Hayek." Interesting. I guess Frederick Hayek was the signature there. It was from Cambridge, May 16th. This was the first we had heard about it. I had given up the idea of going to London, though subconsciously I still believed in it. We were both somewhat frightened, mainly in view of my rather bad health, and especially the silly way in which my corpse reacts to bad weather. That's funny. I am sick of being sick. You will think me a terrible hypochondriac. So do I, but my doctor, a very nice and kind person and an excellent doctor, says that it is unfortunately all true. Anyway, it cannot be helped. And he added, "I'm frightfully scared by the prospect of going to London. I hate meeting new people and tea parties. I can only hope that tea is so rare and precious that parties have gone out of fashion." Wow! What a curmudgeon. Okay, the new worry arose that Hayek had offered to write a preface to the book. I need not tell you that I could not accept this under any circumstances because I'm too proud to accept such an offer, even if it came from President Truman or John Dewey or Shirley Temple. Two, because it would brand the book and myself. Our correspondence had by then switched to the prospect of their arrival in England, and they kindly inquired how much they should take with them to a wartime England, and what presents they might possibly bring. We suggested that it would be lovely if they could bring a cricket bat for our son, and Karl enlisted the help of a very nice son and friend of ours, and now he knows all about cricket and bats. Not that the complaints stopped. On the 25th of August, he wrote, "Our departure problems are appalling, but don't tell that to Routledge. We probably won't be in England before the beginning of December. We still have no permits to enter Great Britain, and I begin to fear that we won't get any. I am of course in continuous contact about this with Hayek, who says that the London University administration has completely broken down." So let me only quote this last letter of the sequence in full. It came from Auckland and was dated the 16th of November. "Dear Ernest, this time we are really off. We've been allotted berths in 2 different 4-berth cabins, though on the MV New Zealand Star sailing from Auckland between November 28th and December 5th, according to the strike situation. It is a freighter, Blue Star Line, carrying normally 12 passengers and at present in the same cabins, 30. We are not terribly pleased to pay £320 for the pleasure of spending 5 or 6 very rough weeks in the company of strangers. I am particularly concerned about the fact that I cannot endure the smell of cigarettes at sea without getting sick. Still, I shall have to get used to it. The passage will be very rough since we sail via Cape Horn, perhaps the roughest spot in all the 7 seas. Our corpses are expected to arrive by the New Zealand Star on January 8th or thereabouts. Please receive them kindly." So he's anticipating him and Henny dying during the passage. Wow, that's a pretty negative attitude. "If there is important news, I suppose, be wireless to the ship. I shall let you know more precisely when they arrive, and if you could, find them a room in a boarding house or hotel, where they might perhaps be brought to life again, it would be very nice indeed. But I know this is practically impossible, so don't waste your time. If you don't happen to hear about such a room, bury them." To be serious, I'm really cheered. He doesn't sound very cheered up. "I am really cheered up by the prospect of seeing you in less than 2 months. A very short time at my age. Yours ever, K." When they arrived, we met them at the docks, and I was happy to be able to bring him the first copy of The Open Society and Its Enemies, which he eagerly scrutinized on the train and bus to our semi-detached house in Brent. Who of us would have dared to hope on that day that despite his fragile health, the new life he had just started would extend over nearly half a century, let alone predict how immensely we would all be enriched during these years by his ever-active mind. Wow, that's some high praise right there. Alright everybody, that's the end of that little segment. Let me go ahead and stop the recording.